Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephen, I'm not Neil Gaiman. Today I'm doing another Beyond the Page where I'm going to focus on a couple of authors who've done something quite well, and I'm going to talk about different aspects within the fantasy genre. So this is not a book review. If you've not watched one of these before, I'm just going to look at a particular facet of writing that I admire, something that I want to bring more into my work, or something that I think other people should be doing. In this instance today, I'm talking about fantasy races. This is non-human races, whether it's dwarfs, elves, goblins, whatever you might want to imagine. There are some people that say you shouldn't use these in your books because the shadow of Tolkien and other big writers in the genre kind of hangs heavy over them, and anything you do will always be compared to them. Which to some degree is true, but equally Tolkien didn't come up with these fantasy races. They come from folklore that go back hundreds of years. It's just his name perhaps is most well associated with particularly elves and dwarves and orcs because of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and so on. But since Tolkien had passed away, there have been decades of books and people have done some incredible things with fantasy races and have done them in a very unique way. They've made them interesting, they've made them their own. And so I'm going to talk about two authors today who've done something really special in the last few years with fantasy races, and it just shows you the potential of what can be done with them. So the first author I'm going to talk about is John Hornor Jacobs. If you haven't read any of his books before, go and check him out, have him a look up online. He is predominantly a horror writer, but he has also done some fantasy books. He did a trilogy of books for Gollancz. The first one is called The Incorruptibles, and this is a sort of fantasy western. It's set in a Roman-like society, but there's, horses and guns and the frontier, and they're sort of growing the world out. But there's also a bit of demonology in there. There's things creeping around the edges, and there are non-human races. One of the two main characters is a character called Shoestring, and he is a half-dwarf. Now immediately you're probably thinking, oh, he's short and he's a miner and he's got a big bushy beard and that sort of thing. But John has done something really interesting with all of the races in his books, particular elves and dwarves. So Shu is a half-dwarf and he's quite long-lived, and rather than just being someone who's, in love with gold and this sort of thing, he's made him almost like a watcher of history. He's someone who's lived through many decades and he's seen how different races are treated, in particular humans and dwarves. He's seen society change, and one of his best friends, the main character, and the other main character is Fisk, who's a human who tries really hard, and he's a really interesting guy, but he's also a frontiersman, so he has to be quite brutal and tough. And Shu is a really interesting guy because he's not philosophical, but he does have a view on things because he's lived through so much and has seen it change, and he's seen how his people have been treated over the decades. And he's just a really interesting character. And then we see how he interacts with normal dwarves who view him a little bit odd because he's sort of a half-breed. And then there are humans who are aware of his dwarven heritage. So it causes a lot of problems. He doesn't have an easy life as it stands, even if he was all one or all of the other. So it's a really interesting thing that he's done. He's built this history into the world, and we see it described through Shu and how he has to navigate through all of these different things. And it's a really interesting, really complicated, really kind of layered approach, rather than just saying he's a dwarf, okay, so that means he's short. Yeah, but what comes with that? What does that mean? What does a dwarf mean within this world and within a fantasy world? The other thing that John has done really interesting is that he has elves, but they're not like any kind of elf you've ever seen before. They're called stretchers by some because they're very, very tall and dangerous and athletic. But they're also called the Vatir, which I think is sort of their own name for them, or it's a slang term that some people use. And they're pretty unknowable. They're not elegant creatures that walk around playing harps and lurking in the woods. They're these savage, brutal monsters in a way that people don't understand because they don't have a common language. Shu, because he's lived such a long time, has met more of them than other people, but even he doesn't understand them, and there's this strange alien quality to them. They don't seem to have an established society as far as we know. They're almost like living on the frontier, and they live around the edges. Wherever men and dwarves and others are sort of pushing out and trying to grow, you find them there. And we don't really know what they want or who they really are, but you find out bits and pieces of them, about their people, about the way they work, about the way they think, because it's so different. And it's really, really fascinating. And it's there again, it's not something I've seen done before. So I definitely recommend checking out the Incorruptibles and the rest of that trilogy to find this kind of frontier trilogy of Western books with guns that are powered by demonology. And there's other things creeping in I don't want to spoil, but it's a really unique perspective on a fantasy world, on a Western world, and on elves and dwarves. The other author I wanted to talk about is Jonathan French. He's got a trilogy of books. The third one comes out September 2021. The first one was called The Grey Bastards, and it is about a group of half-orcs. There again, you're probably thinking, oh, that just sounds a bit dull. Half-orcs, so what? So imagine these orcs don't belong anywhere. They are neither human nor orcs. Real natural orcs, they all have human mothers who were obviously, attacked during fighting. And natural orcs are these really big, powerful, scary, not quite indestructible, but really tough kind of creatures. And the half-orcs are somewhere in between. They're bigger than humans, they're tougher, they're stronger, but they have more human emotions, perhaps, because of their mothers. They are complicated. It appears on the surface that these groups of them protect this kind of no man's land in between the orc lands and the humans. This is where they've been allowed to live and exist. And they run around in these bands, and they all ride giant hogs into battle, which sounds brilliant. It's almost a bit like Sons of Anarchy feel to it. And it's just really, really interesting because of the way they've been raised, because of the fact that they don't have both parents all the time. They're raised in orphanages, and then they're grown and taught how to fight in order to protect what land they have, which is very limited, and it's quite a tough, hot landscape. So they're almost coarse in a way because of their upbringing, because of how they're taught, and they're a bit like biker gangs, as it were. They're very vocal, they fight a lot, they swear a lot, they have relations a lot with women, and it's all part of this thing. And you think, oh, it just seems very laddish and very kind of surface. But if you actually dig and scrape beneath the surface and you get to know the characters, you realise there's actually a lot more going on with them. I don't want to spoil it too much, but I know some people have been put off by the language. There's a lot of swearing in the books. If that bothers you, then they're not the kind of things that you should read. But for me, it fit very much with the way the characters were raised and the way he's built up the society and all of this sort of lot lands, which is this sort of no man's land in between. If they'd all been really polite and well-mannered and well-educated, it wouldn't have fit with the society that they are a part of, these different groups that roam around protecting, like biker gangs, as it were. So it just wouldn't have fit that they're sort of frontier soldiers who are coarse at the way they've been brought up, and it makes perfect sense. The other thing Jonathan's done really well in his books is that he's got halflings. And there again, you're probably thinking, oh, big hairy feet and they're a bit dull and they just sit around smoking pipes all day, but he's made them into something quite disturbing. They live in these underground complexes, almost more like ant warrens, as it were, and they have a long history. Nobody knows too much about them. They keep to themselves, but they do favours for some of the other races that exist in the Lotlands, and they have a deep knowledge of history, and they have their own subtle and dark magic, and they've got their own prophecies, and you get bits and pieces of this, and it's absolutely fascinating because you want to know more about them as the book goes on, and you get little glimpses that were just really rewarding because there again he's created something different, unique and interesting based upon a familiar template. The other fantasy race that I wanted to mention that he's done really something interesting with is Centaurs. You don't see them very often in fantasy books these days. I'm not really sure why. I read a lot of Greek and Roman mythology growing up and they're featured in that quite heavily, but maybe people just don't seem to know what to do with them. And John's done something really, really unique with this. He's made them into this kind of savage, bloodthirsty berserker-like race that when the blood moon comes up, and they don't really know when, they can't kind of track it exactly, they just go into this rampage and start attacking all of the other races within the Lotlands, and they just go absolutely berserk. And when they get wounds, they don't really slow down until they're absolutely dead. And so you have this weird compromise or arrangement between the different races. So the halflings, because they know so much and they have so much knowledge about healing, the orcs really don't. The half orcs, they just kind of have to take wounds and try and survive. But some of them, when they've been injured, have gone to the halflings and have made a deal that if they heal them, in return, when the blood moon rises and the centaurs come, they need help to protect them, and that's the deal. And the halflings seem to know when the moon's going to come up. So that's the arrangement they've made. And so you start to get this weird kind of crossover between all of them. And the centaurs, at some point, it's not much of a spoiler to say, eventually they turn up at some point in the first book, and they're just absolutely crazed and really, really wild and savage and racing around, obviously, because they move very, very fast. And there again, I wanted to know more about them. How did their society get established? Why they're so weird? What is it about the blood moon that drives them into this rampage? And we may never find out some of this stuff, but I've got all those questions in my mind, which just shows you how well it was done and how unique and different it was, because I can't refer to another series and say, oh, centaurs in there are really not just, there's nothing there, there's nothing coming to my mind. And there again, halflings, I've seen them, I read them about, in the Dragonlance books, and you can go back to kind of hobbits, a sort of halfling type thing as well, they're sometimes called. But doing something unique and different and interesting and special, that's hard to do these days, because there are so many fantasy books coming out all of the time. So it's definitely worth looking at people who've done something that you've not seen before, trying to find out why. If there's something that you particularly like, whether it's elves or dwarves or something, and you really want to feature them in your books, can you do something different with them? Can you take inspiration from new people who have done something and move it in your own direction? So I don't think you should never use fantasy races. I've done it in my books, and I've tried to do something different there again. So write what you love, not what other people tell you you should and shouldn't be doing, in terms of, oh, you can't have that in your book. You can, if you do something different, if you do something fresh. And that's hard to do. I won't say it's easy, because there are so many fantasy books coming out every year, but it's always worth trying. It's always worth showing your work to some friends, discussing your ideas with people, see what they think. And if they kind of have that moment of, ooh, that sounds quite cool, I've not heard that before, then you know you're onto a winner, and you should go forward with it and definitely carry on. So 2 authors just to talk about today, make you think about things, check out their work. I'll put some links below to their books, and do something different, do something new, do something fresh that we've not seen before. That's it for today. I'll be back soon with another video.